So here's a speed I won't be going at. Take a default cube, rockify it. Give it a rock material, arrange it into a stream, create a plane for the water, make it fit onto the rocks. Give it a water stream material, make sure we mask out the top faces, make sure we add extra splash to the occluded parts, add a mist pass, tweak some render settings. Done! Hi, this is Aidy at CG Masters. After doing a few of these beginner projects, the goal is to get you to a point where you'll not be able to consider yourself a beginner anymore. So welcome to this complete project in Blender, where we'll be creating this rocky waterfall stream environment. So let's start with the rock. We have our default cube here selected, and we can tab into edit mode and then press W to bring up our specials menu. So we've got a bunch of special tools in here. For example, subdivide and subdivide smooth. These are basically the same, but the subdivide smooth has its smoothness value set all the way to 1. I'm actually just going to set this down to 0 anyway, and with the number of cuts, we've got 1 at the moment, so we've got a vertical and horizontal slice across each face that we had. I'm just going to set that up to 3, so we've got a little bit more, and maybe just add a touch of smoothness to it, not too much, and then come down to the fractal, and then we're going to basically generate some noise to the positioning of everything really. So let's just create a little bit of this, maybe crank it up pretty extreme actually, around 4 or 5. So this is going to be some nasty geometry. We're going to have intersecting faces and edges and stuff. But what we can do is we can just press W to bring up yet more special stuff, and then come down to smooth. And so we're just going to click smooth, and you'll see in the bottom of the tool shelf here in our toolbox area, we've got smoothing as well, so we can adjust the settings there a little bit if we like, but that's okay. I'm going to press S now to scale down, but then I'm going to press Z because I only want to flatten it down on the Z axis. So something a bit like that, so it's a little bit shorter. And then if I tab into object mode, you'll see that every edge looks very, very hard. We have this very faceted look to the whole object. So we can just click smooth over here. Another way to do that, if I tab into edit mode, by the way, was to, again, in the specials menu with the W key, we'll see shade smooth. So we can press the tab key to tab back into object mode, and what we can now do is move over to some more procedurally generated stuff in the properties window, in particular with our modifiers. So if we click on this little spanner icon and add a modifier, the bevel modifier in particular, we can press the Z key to toggle the wireframe here. And what this is doing at the moment is just essentially beveling every single edge. So if I just turn down the width value quite a bit there, you'll see that every single edge is getting 2 edges where there was 1. So I'm going to crank that up for a start so that there's more geometry on every edge. And also I want to change the limit method. So instead of there being none, so in other words every edge gets done, I'm going to set that to angle instead. We could actually specify edges with the weight, but I'm just going to choose an easy option by just setting the angle to maybe around 45, just so that the lower the number here, the more we're going to have beveled. So I'm just going to set that around 45, and then increase the width back to something where it was before, a little bit smoother overall, and then add a modifier, and then subdivision surface modifier to just be below the bevel modifier there. So it's going to bevel, and then with that geometry, it's then going to try and smooth all that geometry for us. And we get something that looks a little bit like this. So kind of getting a bit of a nice natural rocky form. It's also set to 1 in the view, but when we render it, it's going to look more like this. It's set to 2, which to me just seems a little bit too smooth really. So I'm just going to set these both down to 1. And that's it with the modeling really. We could tab into edit mode and then maybe press Control Tab to bring up our mesh select mode, or we could change it down here. Change it to face, for example, and then we could start moving things around. So I could press G and then move that up, and kind of press tab to come out and get a cleaner look at it again. And I like how this is looking, so let's give this a rocky material. First of all, I need to split the 3D view, so I'm going to left click and drag from the right hand side, the top right corner there, to somewhere in the middle. Let's switch that to a node editor and close out that sidebar with the N key. Let's switch from the internal rendering to Cycles rendering engine, and in the properties window I'm going to come over to the rendering tab and switch the device from CPU to GPU to give us a little bit of speed up there. If you don't have that setting, by the way, just take a look at the user preferences and the system tab, take a look at the compute device area and see if you've got any options here under CUDA, for example, anything that shows up in the pull down menu. Alright, and select that there. So we've got a little bit of speed up there. If I press Shift Z, which is the shortcut for rendering view, which is just the same as switching it there, you can see that we've basically got two light sources. We've got the dark grey background, which is controlled under the world tab, so we can change that here to pitch black or whatever we like. I like the fact that this is giving us an overall lighting, just catching a little bit of the darkest areas there, so I'm going to leave that the way it is. So I'm pressing Z to toggle the wireframe, and I'll select the lamp that we have in the scene. Let's come over to that setting, and it's just a point lamp, which means if we split again the 3D view, you can see the position of this lamp is going to affect the brightness and kind of where it's rotating from, where the light source is coming from. But we don't really want that. We want it to behave more like a sun. So I'm going to change that setting there, and now the position of this won't make any difference, but the rotation will. So I'm going to press R and then R again to get a more comfortable trackball rotation and kind of do something a bit like that. Also, the sun, I'm going to select to use nodes, and so that we have this strength value here, and I'm going to set that to about 3, just so that we can have a fairly larger array of values there, going from sort of dark grey to close to white. Then what we can do is come over to select the rock, and we have, by the way, just it's set to cube, so I'm going to double click that there and rename that to rock, and then let's take a look at our material and double click that and set that to rock wet matte, which is what we're going to create now, and let's set that to use nodes, which is just the same as middle click and dragging from the header to give us a little bit more of a view here. You can see it's just the same as this button here for this particular material. So we have this diffuse shader going into this material output. So before we really get stuck into the nodes, one other thing I'd like to mention, if we take another look at the user preferences, under the add-ons, let's make sure that we have our node wrangler enabled, which you can see there if you just type that into the filter, and let's get that enabled, because that's going to allow us to, for example, if we add in with Shift A texture, noise texture, and just drop that somewhere into the scene, if we just hold Control and Shift and click on that node, it automatically plugs it into a viewer node, which is just an emission shader, and just shows us immediately on the model what that is. And also we can go Control Shift again on the node and just sort of keep toggling through the various outputs there. So we're going to find that pretty useful, and then we can just Control Shift click on this, and it kind of removes everything and sets it back the way we want. So this is a great setup for us to now work on our rock material. So let's Control Shift click on this noise texture so we can see what's going on with it again, and then because we do have the node wrangler enabled now, we can go Control T with that selected, and it will auto generate these two nodes for us. So by default we're using the generated coordinates, but I want to use the object coordinates instead, and the reason for that is if I tab into edit mode and select everything with A, we can press S to scale and then Z to scale just on the Z-axis. We're just going to stretch it out along the that Z-axis, and you can see if we look at the noise that basically appears though parts of the noise is sticking to the geometry that we're scaling, whereas if we use the object coordinates instead and try the same thing, we can go S and then Z, you can see instead of it stretching and scaling out the noise, it's actually just revealing more of the noise in the place that it isn't currently projecting onto the geometry. So with that, we can then use our mapping node to actually affect scale and location and rotation and stuff, but we don't want to do that just yet. We'll probably come to that a little bit later on, but that's what those nodes are doing. The reason I want this noise is so that it can inform the bumpiness of this diffuse shader. So we're going to need a bump node. So first I'm going to Control Shift click on the diffuse shader so that it reveals itself within our 3D view there. And then I'm going to go Shift A and then add a vector bump node. For this, we're going to plug the normal of the out of the bump into the input of the diffuse normal. And then let's just give ourselves a little bit more space. And then to inform this bump, let's go from the factor out, so we get a grayscale out of the noise into the height. And you can see our bumpiness is now apparent on this. So what we're doing with this noise, well, we're going to scale this down a little bit, so we're going to make the noise a little bit larger, around 3 or so. With a detail of 0, you basically don't get any high frequency noise, but we want a few layers of frequency in there, up to about 5 or so. Honestly, I don't really tell the difference of any detail level higher than 5, so I tend to stick there. The distortion we can use to kind of, the more you crank this up, kind of gives it this sort of swirly, liquidy view. And since this rock was probably forged in the molten lakes of some sort of lava stream, I'll probably just crank that up just a tiny bit, something like 0.6 or so. It could do with being a little bit higher contrast. For that, I think I'm going to increase the distance value of the bump node up to around 0.3. And to give myself some more control over the noise on this, I'm going to go Shift A and add in a converter color ramp node and just slot that into between the noise and the bump. And that should just automatically shift those nodes out of the way. And now we can kind of increase contrast even further, but we can add points with this add button there, and you can kind of make other refinements to it. Now, one of the best interpolations of the way it goes from black to white I found is using this ease in, ease out kind of interpolation. That way we get almost this sort of flattening wherever this middle slider is, so we can kind of give it a nice sort of polished off view in some of the places, which I think works quite well for these kinds of rocky surfaces. So I'm just going to leave it at around there. So that's pretty much it for the diffuse. What we need next is the glossiness, or in other words the reflections, the shininess, our wetness in this case if you will. So what we can do is come to the end of the diffuse shader, just give ourselves a little bit more space, and then go Shift A and add in the glossy shader. I'm just going to drop that in there for now, and then go Shift A and add in the mix shader, which is just at the top there. I can scroll my mouse wheel to find the missing mix shader there at the top. So then we can just drop that into the connections that are already in existence, and then for the empty socket there we'll plug in our glossy shader, and you'll see that a factor of 0 in the mix is just going to show us what's in the first socket, our diffuse, and then a full 1 is just going to show us the glossiness. And you can see it's not really showing us the bumpiness that we've got, so let's plug in our bumpiness to the normal socket. And then also we can see a roughness value of 0 is going to be like a mirror shine, and then 1 is going to be like a chalky like roughness. But we want it fairly smooth, so somewhere around 0.1 or so is pretty good. We want to also lean it heavily towards diffuse, so we're just going to add in just this a touch. So again, around 0.1 to 2 or so. And then with shiny surfaces, the diffuse color actually tends to be quite a bit darker. So we're just going to bring that down to something like that. So let's take a look at this with Shift Space to maximize, and then we can get a good look at our rock at the moment. So this is going to be our wet kind of stream rock. Shift Space to minimize the view, and we'll begin on our rocky stream. So I'm just going to press Shift Space with the cursor in this view to maximize that, and we'll lay out 4 of these rocks side by side along the x-axis, and then we'll step these down towards the camera once that's created into position along the y-axis. So let's just go Shift D, X to constrain, and then left click to drop that into position, and then GZ, just lower that down a little bit, RZ to rotate that around a little bit, and then Shift D, X, again left click to drop that into position, RZ to rotate that around. Maybe we've gone too far with that, so I'm going to left click and drag that towards about there, and then maybe raise it up a little bit, and then Shift D, X to constrain along the x-axis, left click to drop it into position, RZ just key in 90 on the keyboard there, and let's see, GZ to lower that down a little bit. So those first 4 rocks are into position. Now we're going to step them down. So with all 4 selected, so Shift select them all, I'm just going to go Control Alt Q, and then we'll get a quad view, so we'll see things from the top, from the front, and from the right side. And then from the right side we'll get a good view of what's actually happening here in our perspective view. I'll just go Shift D and just raise it down and to the left from this viewport here, maybe snug it in, something like that, and then just go Shift R to duplicate that, and then Shift R to duplicate that again, and then again, and then again, and then again, and then again. So something maybe like that. Now let's just go Control Alt Q to come back to this view, and I'm just going to clean up this view even further by pressing N to bring up the properties sidebar, and let's just take a look at what is renderable right now. So we have all of these, which is looking super repetitive, but we're just going to fix that now. So I'm just going to press B and then left click and drag across those lower, however many that is, all of them apart from the top 4 basically. And then what we'll do is we'll just add some randomization to the Z rotation. So Object, Transform, and then randomize the transform. Now in the toolbox area you'll find our randomized rotation section along the Z axis, and let's just left click and increase that, and we'll basically get the rotation randomization that we want, all the way up to 180. At that point it's just a case of just correcting anything you think might be too repetitive, so maybe this is too similar to that, so I'm just going to rotate that around a little bit, so R and then Z, something like that, and then maybe anything else that catches your eye, but I think that that's okay for the most part. So let's go shift space to minimize the view again, and we'll take a look in our rendered view down here, and that's pretty good for the basics of it. Now we'll duplicate one of these rocks and use it for a kind of separating edge that runs down the side. So let's go shift space in this view. With any of these selected really, we can go shift D, X, and then scale it up a little bit with the S key. RY90 to put it on its end there. In fact, I think I'll flip it around a bit. So RZ180. And all we need to do now is just push this against the others. It's going to be all just simple duplicating, rotating, and moving really at this point once we get into it. But first, I'm going to give this a separate material because I don't want it to be quite as wet as the other ones. So we've got 33 objects using this material at the moment. This object, I want to have a separate one. So let's click on the 33 so it duplicates that material, and we can just rename this to rock matte. And really the only thing we need to do with it is just increase the roughness and increase the brightness of the diffuse. So let's just crank it up a little bit like that. So now shift space in that viewport again, and we can lay these out. So no surprises, shift D and then Y to constrain along the Y to constrain along the Y axis. And then just move them down into position like this. And then let's give these some unique rotations. So RX, maybe tuck that in a bit with the G key. RX the other way a little bit. Let's move that down, something like this. And then S to scale that down even further. Maybe double tap R to go into trackball rotation to give that bit more uniqueness along there. So with that, we can now border select across them all with the B key, shift D X to copy the whole thing. So now we have our two streams. I'd like to have some more rocks in the over on this left side though. So I'm going to press B and border select across those rocks. Let's go Z though to take a look in wireframe. You can see we've picked up a load of extra rocks we didn't want in that selection though. So I'm going to press B and then middle click and drag across these, and that should remove them from the selection. Z to toggle the wireframe back into solid shading view, shift D, X to constrain and push them all over onto the left side. And then one more border select with the B key, and then we want to duplicate everything now, move it forward along the Y axis, GZ to drop it down, and then let's just kind of reposition this, just squash them into the existing ones a bit better. So something like this. Yeah, that's all the geometry I think we need for now on these rocks. So shift space to minimize the view, and now we'll position a camera. I'm going to use this bottom left 3D view for that. So I'm going to press Z a couple of times to toggle into wireframe, and then let's scroll out a little bit, and then around about here is the angle I'm going for, and now I'm going to go Control Alt and 0 on the numpad, and that will allow us to snap the camera that was in the scene into the current position that we had there. Now I'll go shift space again because we want to get to our properties window. I'm just going to give the windows a little bit more space though. So something like that. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. On the rendering tab, I'm going to set the Y value down a little bit so it makes it more epic widescreen-esque. And then something like that. And then let's scroll in a little bit further. The next thing I'll do is with the property sidebar with the N key, I'm going to find the lock camera to view option, which is right there, which is a little bit difficult to make out at the moment, but you can kind of see lock camera to view there. So I'm just going to enable that. And now that means as we move around, the renderable camera will stick to it. Otherwise, if we didn't have that, it'll just pop out from the view. And it's 0 on the numpad to pop back into the camera view, and we can position that into the middle of the space we have here. And then I'm going to again lock camera to view, which is this option. So we can close those sidebars down, hit Shift Z, and now we can take a look at the rendered view. Also, we can stop it from rendering what's outside of the camera, so we don't need it to slow down unnecessarily there. So we can just enable our border there. So it's only going to render what's inside the border of the frame within the camera frame. So now we can just position this a little bit more accurately. So I think I'm going to go for something like, let's just find a decent space, a bit of space, something like this maybe. Basically, I'm trying not to weight it too much on the foreground, so I'm just going to have that in just a little bit. Something like that looks pretty good, but we've got a little bit of space in the background there, so I'm going to select that rock, and basically just scale it up so that it fills that space. So something like that. Maybe the one next to it up a little bit as well. So something like that. So now also I'm just going to make it look like there's a slightly different flow to what's going on there. And so select this one, and I'm just going to scale this one up a little bit more. So let's just scale that up, maybe move it off to the side a little bit. So with that refining in, I'm pretty happy with the position of the camera there. And we'll just take a look at the light. To find it, I'll look in this 3D view here. I'll go Shift Space and then uncheck the only render option, and then we can see it pop up here. So I'll select it, press G to move it out of the way, and then Shift Space to take a look in rendered view while we do this, N to close out that sidebar, and then let's double tap R to enter trackball rotation. And really all I'm looking for is far more shadows in the scene now. So I'm going to cast it over there so it's kind of puts one whole side of the rocks almost into a shadow. And also I'm kind of glancing it against the rocks as well to make that more extreme. So something like that, about that kind of angle. And the only other setting I want to change now, if we come over to the sun lamp settings, is this size value. So this is going to give us the appearance of it kind of being a bit hazier, as though the sun is shining through a bit of hazy sky really. So I'm going to set that up to around 0.4. So we're essentially blurring out the shadows a bit there. So let's add some geometry to act as our foamy water going down our rocks. So let's go Shift Space in this view, go Shift A to add in a mesh at plane. And let's take a look from the top view by pressing 7 on the numpad. Press G to move that somewhere centrally. And then let's scale this up a little bit. So S, and then left click to confirm that, and then S and then Y to stretch it out in that direction. And let's take a look from the side by pressing 3 on the numpad, and then R to rotate that, because I just want that to be slightly more in alignment. So G again to just position that a bit better. And now let's take a look at the geometry of this. So I'm going to tab into edit mode and just alter this so that it's not just one long stretched out rectangle. I want this to be more evenly distributed when we come to conform this onto our rocks below it. So let's go Control R to add in an edge loop. And then instead of just the one, because that's still quite rectangular, I'm going to scroll the mouse wheel to create 2 there. And then left click to confirm, right click to just leave them in position so they don't get slid. And then let's select, deselect with A, and then A again to toggle the selection so that we get everything this time. And then W to bring up the specials menu, subdivide, and then let's take the number of cuts up to about 3. And that's all I want on the geometry for now. So tab back into object mode, and we're going to do the rest of the geometry on it in modifiers. So we're going to go all procedural now. So let's go Shift Space to minimize that view. And then we don't need this rendering all the time for now. So just Z to toggle the wireframe. And then let's come over to our modifiers tab. Find the add modifier, subdivision surface, set the view to about 4. That should be enough geometry to project. And then add modifier, let's see, we want our shrink wrap modifier, and that's going to basically find a target for us. I'm just going to deselect that though for now with the A key. In fact, actually, let's get this out of the way entirely. So let's press H to hide that. And what we're going to do is, because we need an object to shrink wrap that plane onto, we need all of these. And so far, these are all individual objects. So we're going to need to join all this together. So let's go Shift Space so that we can see what we're doing. 7 to take a look from top view there on the numpad, and then press B to border select across the kind of middle of the stream there. So let's take a look what we've got in wireframe. So it looks like we've got everything, but we've got a couple of extras there. So B, middle click and drag across those to deselect them from the selection. So just remove them from the selection, I should say. So let's go Control J to join them all together, and now we've just got one object. While we're here, let's just find this in the outliner. So I'm going to use the full stop in the numpad, just do zoom to it there, double click on the name. I'm going to call this the rock stream, just like that. So now what we can do is bring back our other plane that we had, Alt H, and then let's just select that. And in fact, while we're in the mood for naming, I'm going to press the full stop again in the numpad, and then double click that and then call that stream water, and then it's disappeared down into alphabetical order there. So let's just take a look at this. So now, right, the shrink wrap modifier. Let's find our target, click on the eyedropper, and then we can see you can see the object name is rock stream. So let's just click that, and immediately it's jumped into view. Now it is going to be a bit on the faceted side because we haven't set this to be smooth. So we can do that over here. Seeing how this is all squished up, let's just tab into edit mode, go W, and then shade smooth. So that should look marginally better, but as you can tell, not much. And that's because the method we're using is nearest surface, and we don't want that. We want project. And we don't want to project positively because that's going to go that direction. We want to go project negatively backwards onto the rocks. So turn off positive and set it to negative. Now if we zoom in a little bit, you can see that it could do with being a little bit further away from the rocks because we're getting a lot of weird Z fighting there, that flickering that you get since the polygons are in exactly the same place. So we're going to use our offset and just scroll that up a little bit out of the way, and that's about right. Now the other thing that we can do with this is just make sure it's within our camera view there. So we can grab the Y axis and kind of slide it down into somewhere we want, just to refine the position of it a little bit, but it was pretty much in the right place anyway. So with that, I'm going to now apply the subdivision and apply the shrink wrap. And that's going to allow us to actually refine the position of this a little bit more. So I'm going to take this and just pull it away from the rocks a little bit more, and maybe pull it up a little bit from the rocks a little bit more as well. Now it's time to give this its foamy texture and material. So let's click on the new material button, and we can delete this diffuse shader with the X key. And instead we're going to go Shift A and add in a mix shader, because we're going to mix between the transparent shader, which we can stick in the first slot, and in the second slot we can have our emission shader, which is what we can apply on lights and things like that to spray light into the scene and have it light up nearby objects and stuff. We don't really want it to do that. I just really want it to just show up without any shading whatsoever, really, a bit of an effect. So if I come over to the Object Data tab, we can turn off in the cycles settings pretty much everything on this. So if we just go Shift Z and take a look at it in the view there, you can see we've only got camera. If we turn that off, we're getting no visibility at all. So we don't want it to affect any of these things, and that should actually help it to speed up rendering slightly as well. So to derive the factor of this mix shader, what we want is a noise texture, which you may have guessed. And then we're going to increase the contrast of this with the color ramp node, which you may have guessed. So anyway, we're going to plug these in and then plug this into here. And then we're going to increase the contrast a bit, something like this. And you can see we're getting effects in the view there. We want a little bit more control over the positioning of this though. So with the texture selected, I'm going to go Control T and auto generate these nodes. So the scaling of the UVs, the texture coordinates, I'm going to squish down the X. In fact, the other way, I'm going to scale up the X coordinates. So we're getting it a little bit more streaky like that, somewhere around 3. And then with the Y, we can scale this down, something like 0.3 or so to really stretch that out. The scale of the noise is looking about right. I think we can maybe just increase that a little bit further now that we've got our scaling in position, and maybe the detail even can go up to about 5. So something like that. I'll switch off the rendering in this viewport with Shift Z and then enable it in this one again with Shift Z. So when we zoom in here a little bit, you'll see if we take a look at what's happening on the Z axis, which you can see denoted here with this little icon. You can see it's not quite as streaky on the stuff where it's falling, and I suppose that's where you would expect it to be especially streaky. So we're going to grab our Z value in the scaling of the mapping and kind of crank that up a little bit. Let's take a look. So yeah, that's looking pretty cool. You've got the tops of surfaces though, which I expect would probably be less apparent. This streakiness would be less apparent. So let's kind of try and mask that out a little bit. So with these two nodes at the end, we're going to press G and move them out of the way to give us some extra space. And then let's go Shift A and then go Color Mix RGB node and drop that in. And also we're going to kind of raise this up a bit because we'll work above what we've done. So we'll stack them up kind of like layers. So with this, we can take our normals, which is the direction in which faces are pointing, and that's what we want, the ones that are reaching towards the sky. So let's go and get Converter, Separate X, Y, Z. and we can plug our normal into this. And so which axis is it that we need? Let's find out. So Control Shift click on this to just see the x-axis, and now let's click it again, Control Shift click on this, and you can see it's the y-axis is what we need. So let's plug the y-axis into this node. So now we're mixing what we can see here in with our streaks. So instead of mixing it though, we're going to multiply it and then set that to all the way up to 1. And you can see it's basically masking out the bits that we do want to keep and not the bits that we don't. So what we want to do is invert that y-axis stuff. So with that, it's pretty simple. We can just add in a color ramp to do that, and that will give us the opportunity to also change contrast on it if we want as well. So I'm going to click these double arrows to basically flip it, to invert the color from being black to white to black. And you can see we're basically getting pretty much what we need there now. So let's Control Shift click on the mix shader to remove the viewer node, and then we'll get a good idea of the actual results now. There's two more things that I'd like to add to this shader, so kind of like two more layers. So we can kind of consider this first thing down here, the streaks, as the first layer, then what we've just added as the second layer, then we're going to have two more layers. So for that, I'm going to take the color mix RGB node, go Shift D, duplicate that up, and then let's set this just back to mix, and I'm going to set that to 0, so it's only going to show us what's coming through the first socket. And then let's duplicate that again, Shift D. So now we've got spaces for the third layer and the fourth layer. So let's Control left click on this output here and put it to where our new end is going to be. And let's hook all these up appropriately. So this one is going to go in the first socket of this, and this one is going to go in the first socket of this. Even though these nodes here aren't actually doing anything at the moment because they're just set to 0, and so they're basically just passing straight through. But it does give us a space in which to plug in something in the third layer and something in the fourth layer, so to speak. So what is it that we want to put in there though? So what we're going to do is we're going to add in where this water is falling, in these kinds of pockets, we're going to have kind of little bits of white. So almost like, you know, that sort of splashing type of thing. So to do that, we need to know, or at least we need a way to be able to get the kind of crevices of our geometry. So there is a way to do that. So we can go Shift A and take the input geometry node. And if we Control Shift click on here, you get all sorts of wonderful stuff. And it's the pointiness node that we want though. So we're going to pair this with a color ramp, drop that in. And then what we can do is increase the contrast quite a lot on this until we can just see that we're pretty much just getting the very tips, the very edges, the very pointiness aspects of it, if you will. But we don't quite want that. What we're going to do is just flip this around using these double arrows here. And now we're pretty much just, if we tighten in the white a little bit to make it brighter, we're getting, let's just sort of shift these about just slightly more. We kind of want just those kinds of areas, but you'll see that it kind of looks a bit on the streaky side, and this is unintentional this time, and that's because if we take a look at the Z to take a look at the wireframe, you can see that we've really not quite got enough geometry there. So I'm going to come over to the modifiers tab and add another subdivision surface, and this should fill it in nicely for us. And I'm just going to set those back to both to 1. So let's go Shift Z to take a look, and you can see it's not quite as bad anymore. So without, it's looking like this, and then with, it's looking like this. So that's the more of the sort of idea that we're looking for. So let's come over to here and essentially just plug this into where we've set up for our third layer. And then if we Control Shift click on this, we can see the results. And at the moment, we're going to get nothing because it's just kind of showing us what we had before. But now if we mix this in, you can kind of see those that result that we had. But instead of mixing it, I'm just going to add the white areas onto it. And now what we can do is press M to mute it, so we can see what it would be like without, and then M, whoops, and then M with the cursor in the node window to unmute that, and you can kind of see that coming back in. The thing about this though is I'm going to just change these to be clamped so that we're not going to get values outside of 0 and 1, because that can really mess up the results of these sorts of mix shaders. So for now, let's just consider that bit done, and then we'll move on to our final aspect, which is basically towards the edges here. You're getting a very sharp cut off, and I'm just going to fade that out just because we can. And what we could do, and the way we can do that is if we go Shift A and add in a texture gradient texture and Control Shift click on this, you'll see that basically it just means it goes from black on the left hand side and white to the right hand side there. But if we run this through yet again a color amp node, we can remap the values, so from going from black to white to black again. So let's just click the plus to add another flag in the center there, and then we just drag this all the way up to white so it's not mid-gray. And then this final one now, we're going to set that back to black, and you can kind of see now in the viewport as well, it's going from black to white back to black again. And this is going to be multiplied because we want to darken the edges. If we want to brighten something, we'll add, and if we want to darken, we'll multiply. And then if we Control Shift click here, you can kind of see nothing at the moment, but when we slide this up, you're going to get the edges begin to darken there. So we're going to leave that at full, and then we're going to Control Shift click on the mix shader, and you can kind of see the end result. So let's finish up and do a final pass over everything. We'll start by taking a look at how things are in the camera view. And so that we don't move the camera accidentally, let's press N and bring up the property sidebar and unlock the camera to view. Now if we zoom in, we're not going to move that. And so we can see a little problem here with the rocks underneath this plane peeking through. So with this one selected, I'm just going to left click and drag on the gizmo there on the y-axis and just pull that forward. And if we want a little bit extra control, we can hold shift just to get that right into position so we're not moving it too drastically. And then while we're here, we can copy this across to the second stream, as we don't have one here yet. So let's go Shift D, X, and move that across. Something about there looks about right, but again we can always come in and reposition that to wherever we need. So taking a look at the render overall at the moment in our camera, you can see it's kind of a bit on the monotone side, so let's just get a little bit of color in there. So I'm going to select the sun lamp, and let's take this and tweak it into being a little bit more blue, so a bit more sky-esque. And then with these rocks here, the larger ones, we're going to tweak this and make this a bit more orange, so something a little bit like this. Doesn't have to be too drastic or anything. Also, if we take a look a bit closer, I think these rocks could be a bit craggier, so for that we want our bump node, and let's set the distance up to something more like 0.7, so something like that. And also, since we scaled these rocks, we've not got as much noise pattern across the surface, so if we go Control A and apply the scale, you can see that we get more noise there now, and we need to do that to everything that we scaled up. So let's go and go Shift L, select linked material, so we're going to get all the objects using that material, and go Control A and apply the scale. So that's done that to everything now. And I think we could probably just do with a little bit more rocks in general. I'm going to press B and middle click and drag across these on the left side, and then go Shift D and X to just move these off to the side a little bit. And then what we could do is take a look at individual origins, so that when we go to rotate these around, so double tap R, we can get something a little bit more like this. Maybe scale them down a bit as well, something like that. And then it's just a case of kind of fixing whatever you think now, really. So you could add a ton more rocks if you liked. So let's just grab this one here, Shift D, and move that off to about here. Double tap R, I'm going to rotate that around for something a bit more different. So maybe do that again, actually, double tap R, something like that maybe. And then also this one here, I'm not too happy with the straight edge that we've got kind of there. So let's just select that one, double tap R, and we'll see if we can get something a bit more interesting. So perhaps something a little bit like that's looking a bit curvier and a bit bumpier, quite like that. Also in the foreground here, I think we could sort of push those in slightly and kind of get a different kind of silhouette happening here as well. Maybe grab this one, Shift D to duplicate it and move it right into the scene, scale it right down, S, and then move that back a little bit, maybe double tap R to rotate it. And you can tell you could probably just do this all day long until you're happy with it. So it's very simple and easy things to do at this stage. So maybe something like this, just to kind of get a different interesting shape happening. Actually, just a couple more super fast tweaks with this rock here. I'm just going to move this out a little bit more, like something like this, maybe to about there, something like that. And then also this rock here, I think we could probably do with maybe one more. I'm just going to rotate this a little bit more like this, and then Shift D to duplicate that to there, scale it down a bit, and then rotate that completely around, something like this. Alright, so let's get on with our mist pass. So before I do any more tweaks, okay, so we can come over to our compositing nodes by clicking on this icon here, and then we can use our nodes by clicking on that icon. So what we have here is a render layer, and our render layers can be found on the second tab of the properties window. You can see there they go. And then if we take a look at our passes, we've got our Z pass included in the render, but we also want to include our mist pass. So you can see pop it up there now. Now, where are the mist settings? Well, if we come over to the world tab, we'll find our mist pass settings here. We're just going to leave these at default. So it starts 5 units away from the camera, and then it'll be really misty 25 units beyond that. What we need to do to be able to see anything going on here though is to render. So we're going to need to go F12 to render, and then we'll carry on. So here's our render, and now we can just use the escape key to come back to that window. And if we go Shift Space to make this full screen, you can see here's our image now showing up in the render layer. We can have it showing up a lot larger in the backdrop by enabling this option, but obviously still nothing has changed. What we actually need is a viewer node, and if we Control Shift click on the render layers, you'll see that that gets auto generated for us, this viewer node. And what we want to do is Control Shift click again, and we'll take a look at all the different passes, and you can see the mist pass looks like this. So what we can do is go Shift A, add a converter color ramp node, and slot that in, and now we can actually control where the mist is starting, and in fact where it's ending. What we want to do is kind of add this onto the original image. So what we can do is go Shift A and add a color mix node, drop that in there, plug this into the second socket and this into the first socket, Control Shift click on here, and then you can see it's just mixing in fully the mist pass at the moment, and if at 0 we're just going to see the original image. So if we just set this to add and set it to clamp so we don't get values above 1, we're going to just scroll this up to something like this, because I expect it probably would be quite misty actually, seeing how there's a lot of water spraying around. And then we can plug this into the composite node, which is actually what gets rendered when you hit F12. So with that, I think we're pretty much done. I think it would be fairly misty. We can actually just tweak the position of that mist, but I think it looks pretty good as it is, maybe just slightly tucked in there. So let's go Shift Space, and there's a couple more things we can do. Let's stop that rendering with Z. Let's tuck that right in. And then a couple of final tweaks that we can do is come over to the color management, the scene tab, which we can find here. And then instead of it being default, we can set that to film. We get quite a nice crush of contrast there. And then also we've got all these looks to choose from. We can kind of set it to any number of these. In fact, you can hold Control and middle scroll the wheel through these until you find something that you quite like, or you can continue editing in the node window to just do some more color correction and things like that in there. And then also you can change the exposure and gamma settings if you want to just find a nice default in here and you want to just sort of tweak it slightly. But I'm just going to leave it at that and just tweak some final render settings, and then we're basically finished. So for this we need to set that back to 100% for our final render. The other thing is we want to set up the amount of samples that we're using so that the render isn't quite as noisy. For that, it looks like we could probably get away with 50, but feel free to experiment at 100, 150, 200 even. Every scene can be quite different like that. But in any case, if you're doing a animation, you want to make sure you've got this enabled, but we're not really, so we don't need to, but it's just a habit to get into. It gives you a different noise pattern for every frame. Anyway, then we've got our light paths, which we'll all set at default there, and we can see our performance has this tile section. This can impact rendering speed quite a bit. And one of the ways in which to not have to worry about this is to use an add-on. So we can just go File, User Preferences, Add-ons, and then if we just type in Tile, there you can find auto tile size. So let's just enable that, and you can see auto tile size shows up now, and it's set to 240 by 205. So we'll just leave it at that and be confident that it's all nicely going to be optimized for us. And then we just need to set an output wherever you like and the type of image you want. But that's going to wrap this up. This is the final image, and if you'd like to take this a step further, you can try this. There's a challenge on the main page with some node layouts to help you get there if necessary. And I hope you enjoyed this project overall and learned a few things. And as always, if you have any questions and comments, post below. We're always happy to respond, and subscribe and like and all that good stuff to stay tuned for more.